Okay, so now we're in Substance Painter. We've imported our model, which you should have in your files here. It's a very simple process. You just new select your mesh, wherever that is. I think it's tutorials, texturing, models. This one here. You just import that. I set it to OpenGL because that's how Marmoset interprets the normals. I usually do it in 2048 because my computer is not good enough for 4K. And you'd also, add all your textures, your bakes basically, which are also included in the project files. So once you've done that, you'd just go into your all your maps and you just plug in each one, and then, like I said previously, if you uncheck everything but the position and world space normal, these are ones I generally like to bake. It's not necessary for this project because we won't really be using smart masks or anything, but now we have all the maps that you need to texture a prop. So now that we've done that, just a brief word about display settings. Just get this up here. What I always generally do is activate a custom color lookup table. Again, you'll find this in the project files. It's ACES standard log. There is, I'm not quite wise about it, but I think it's like the standard of video editing, or color correcting. I don't quite know exactly what it is, but it looks good. It gives you like a much nicer contrast in colors. It ups saturation slightly. Just a few other things, but it basically just makes it look a bit nicer. And to also get it to work, you have to activate tone mapping and set that to a log, set the function to log. And from here, if you need to, you can also increase the exposure settings. I like to just have the environment in the background, but very blurred. The HDRIs I also like to use are generally just the plain studio ones, as these will give you more correct color information in your actual texture. If you use any of these HDRIs which actually have color, actual photo textures, obviously the color from the global light is going to bleed into your texture and you might not get accurate results. Another one I also use, Tomoko Studio is a good one I like to use, even though it has a bit of color in, but otherwise all of these do a really good job. And they all have different uses, so just experiment if you feel like you need to. I'm going to stick with Tomoko here, and the first thing I like to do when starting out texturing is just whack on some basic smart materials. Substance Painter comes with a great variation of them, and you can just instantly go in, view what it's going to look like. Probably won't end up using any of these, but it just gives you a great idea of what you may be looking for. So here, this one here, it looks very similar to the lime scale that we're going to be using, and you can instantly get an idea of what your finished texture is going to look similar to, because with any 3D production or asset kind of like that, you're not really going to know what it's going to look like until far into the production. So to motivate me, possibly other people as well, I like to just get like an instant result, so I can think, alright, it will look decent in the end. So we can see if we take rust, just simple rust, it's not going to be our final texture, but you can see it looks pretty decent, and you can kind of get a sense of what it's going to look like in the end. You can even try like very strange textures. If we rotate this 90 degrees, you know, you can kind of experiment, see what works, see what doesn't. You might get inspired, maybe not. It all depends on well, just what you plug in. You never know. So once I've just gone through and had a bit of a play to motivate me, or just see what might work, we're gonna go in and just look at some procedural textures now, and we're gonna look first at the flakes of rust in our rust texture. Right, so now we're in Substance Designer. You can follow along yourself if you go into your files and pick the Part 4 Substance file. Just a quick word about dependencies. You may need to, it'll probably ask you to fill in all the dependencies because there are quite a few like custom nodes, but I should have them all bundled in. You go to the file, folder files, it might look a bit different to this, but in substance files, Mordred Rust, dependencies, you should find all your dependencies here, and if I ask for them, just go through individually. It is a bit of a pain, but I'm not quite sure how else to do it really. Another word is there are some dependencies which are not mine, but free files on Substance Share. So we have PG Fine Edge Detect and one of Algorithmic's bitmaps. This isn't too important, but it's there in the texture. So if you want these, just go to Substance Share, follow these links. Again, links to Substance in the texture folder. Oh, sorry, it's in the project folder files. And again, just plug those into the dependencies of the graphs. Okay, so well, this is the graph for the basic flakes themselves of rust, or peeling flakes. I'm not quite sure how best to describe them. It's relatively simple and straightforward, although obviously Substance Designer graphs never entirely look pretty straightforward themselves. We do have a few custom nodes here. I'll explain along the way. It's generally simple, and yeah, I'll just explain along the way. So what we start off with here, I'll show the 3D view at first and see what we're doing with the graph. You can see here very well that the main thing about the texture is this kind of like gradient lip that lies on the rust itself, and this very clear layer, and you've got these holes show the material underneath this layer of rust, or it could be paint, it could be paper, plastic. There are all sorts of different things that you could use for this. Another thing, as always, there's always multiple ways to skin a cat in Substance Designer. This is just the way that I've worked out how to do it. So we start by trying to make the base texture for our cracks, or our fine cracks here. And this is what we use the Fine Edge Detect node for. The base edge detect in Substance Designer has it, it does very thick lines, so it's not particularly useful in some scenarios, even though it is a very good tool. So the fine edge detect obviously does what it says on the tin. It gives you a lot more finer detail. And with the base texture, I love to use clouds. We just blur that and we warp it in on itself. It will warp outwards, and it will create these nice like areas of contrast between these cloudy peaks. I'm not quite sure how to describe it really, but it creates these kind of like bubbles, and yeah, I really like using these kinds of textures because you can also clearly see where the cracks are going to propagate. You can imagine really, and then I'm just going to blend that with a custom node that I make. Again, these you can just make by just a pure tile generator. They're pretty simple. Again, like I've said, it's not going to be a in-depth Substance Designer tutorial. I'm going to assume that you know at least a basic to intermediate level. And this is just a opacity mask that I use for that blend. So what I always like to do is have large areas and small areas, which you can see, and we're gonna. That's how we're gonna look. We try to explain it. So we have these are going to create large areas with larger cracks. So we can see here these larger planes of cracks, as opposed to the more noisy areas here. And that just goes hand in hand with areas of contrast, small and large details. I always like to go through auto levels every now and again. At any rate, just for like my own visual clarity. This levels node here is going to control our cracks here. So if we go into our levels and we adjust them, we can see how this is going to change. Excuse me. I'm going to change the small cracks that we have in our texture. Again, with our fine edge, we have parameters here which we can change if we need to. We will invert that, and so here we have our fine cracks, our high frequency detail. But what I want is some large cracks to overlay on top of that, and for that we just use a simple process of again, this is a custom node, but we going to warp that slightly with the new Substance non-uniform direct warp node. This is incredibly useful. I use this all the time in my substances now. It's one of the best new features, definitely. And then we're going to have run that through an edge detect, warp it again with another custom node. Again, you can just use a tile generator for this. Blend those two together so that we get these, contrasting large and small cracks. And you can kind of get an idea, if we look at the 3D view, how that's going to translate, over as we finish the effect. What this also is going to do is, with these cracks here, it's going to create islands which we're going to need for the flood fill. So the flood fill is to use for designating multiple different areas of the mask, of the shape, that we're then going to run through a random grayscale So you can see all the different islands here, and you can see how these cracks have created a lot of these different islands. And with that random grayscale, we're going to run it through a histogram select. Going to get the contrast up all the way to 1. And with this, we can just isolate our islands from the flood fill. And you can see how this basically creates the holes in the rust texture itself. And you can obviously change the range, how much holes you need or want. You know, you can really mess around with the noisiness of the texture. This is why I love Substance Designer, because you can just instantly change things like that, and you know, it's fantastic for iteration. I've then blended that back in. I don't actually believe you need to do this. Yeah, there's basically no difference. So you could just, you know, attach this to here. It wouldn't really make any difference. So that's my fault. But then we're gonna refine the shape of these rust flakes, or these holes in the mesh, holes in the texture, sorry. And for this, we're just gonna blur and then tighten up that shape with a histogram scan node. This is a very simple technique, do it all the time. It just refines the shape and, you know, gets rid of some of these noisy cracks. Because if we weren't to do that and we were to just straight put these through, it's going to look a bit noisy, and you're not going to get those clearly defined holes in the texture. So that's why we do that. And then we're just going to, again, these are custom scratch nodes, but you could do these a million different ways. But we're going to blend these into the mask itself again. And that's how we get our base mask for the holes in our rust. And that's going to be the basis for how we get our peeling effect as well. So for our peeling effect, we want a gradient going out from these holes. So we want a gradient. You can see these lips. They're going to be a gradient coming out from these holes. We do that with a distance node, and we set it at a very small distance, but we're getting that gradient now. And then we're going to blur it. So we're going to blur that very linear sharp gradient. Let me show you what I mean. Easier to explain. So here, this is just with a distance, and you can see we've got that gradient, but it's very sharp. Doesn't look very good. If we run it through a non-uniform blur, or you could also do a straight blur, although I like the randomness and the different levels that a non-uniform blur will give you. That's going to soften that linear gradient, and now you can see how you can really see how we're going to end up with our final texture. So now what we need to do is refine that gradient with a curves node, and you can see this is basically going to control how we see the curve, how sharp it's going to be, or how shallow. And yeah, you can fiddle about with this how you want. But now you can see that's how we basically created the flakes themselves. And I forgot to mention this blend node here. All we're doing here is we're taking this blurred this blurred node, and we're just subtracting the holes away from it. So that's how we get the lips of the that peeled effect. And then what we're going to do now is we want to push this rust layer up a bit in the height level. So we're going to run that through a histogram range. We're going to invert our holes mask and put that into the opacity of this blend. And so now we can very clearly see that layer of rust and that peeled effect. And basically that's how we do it. That's how we get the finished effect. Yeah, you could tighten this up a bit, probably make it a lot more, a lot better, look a bit better. But as a quick and rough kind of thing to do, it does the job. If we see here, we can see a lot better. We can see how that translates into the final texture as well. And this is what I'm talking about. The if you get the one thing about your texture right, the rest is gonna kind of like slot into place. So now that we've got this, the rest of the texture is going to be a walk in the park, because this already looks really good. So, you know, anything extra is just going to add to it, really. But make sure that this is the most important part of the texture, and you don't mask it with any changes, kind of like, you know, interfere with the main shape, if you understand what I mean. Now I'm just going to go through some of the basic custom nodes that I use, and that you can find in the texture itself. I won't go into detail about all of them, but you can obviously have a look yourself if you want, and they're pretty self-explanatory, really. This basic Gaussian variation, 001, I use it all the time. It's incredibly useful, incredibly simple. Basically what I use it for generally is opacity masks in blends. So I get a really nice random variation of any two textures, basically. And that's where you see I use it the most. You see, all it is a basic tile generator, auto levels, and I've also stuck some various parameters on it. All very simple. Next, we've got a aptly named Squarey Scar, and this again, incredibly simple. It's just a tile generator with some parameters, but I found myself using or needing to use kind of like this angular texture for warping, yeah, mainly warping uses. So that's what I would also encourage you to do if you find yourself doing something a lot or needing something a lot. Just make a tool for it. It takes maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, but once you've done it, it will save you a hell of a lot of time, and it will make you a lot more efficient. That is the purpose of creating these custom nodes, and you will not regret it if you do it. But they're incredibly important. And this grunge or custom noise grunge here. Okay, so with this custom grunge texture, it's a bit more complicated and it uses a lot of dependencies. which I think it's slightly messed up, but I think it still does the job really. To ignore all the red lines and everything, I think it still works. Yes. So yes, it's a bit more complicated, but again, once you've done it, once you've created something like this, you're going to use it all the time. I use this all the time. It's incredibly useful. It saves a hell of a lot of time. Again, it's just a simple. I'm using that squarey scatter node from before, running it through blur, and you can see this Gaussian variation. And I'm using that as the opacity for this blend. And you can see how it creates this nice random variation. I'm doing a tile. I'm just tiling this texture here. I know it doesn't look like it, but I think these two are supposed to be connected. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the graph. Something strange about the dependencies. But you can see how we're just tiling that. Again, blurring that a bit. Again, tiling these fibers, so we get these nice scratches. And we're just refining these forms. This what we do here to warp these scratches here with the morph grayscale. We probably won't use that anymore, because now that we have a non-uniform direct warp, that basically does the whole job for us. And like I said before, I use it all the time. It's a really great node. We're just going to run this through blurs, blend it before, and I see. So this, we're basically using this. Yeah, we're just overlaying and blending all these different noises and patterns together. We're blurring this slightly. We try to create these ghostly kind of like trails from these scratches, blending them back in to the texture. And you can take a bit more a deeper look at this yourself. It's all very straightforward, self-explanatory. We're just blending a lot of different scratches into each other and creating a tool which, you know, you add a lot of parameters to. As you can see, a lot of parameters, and you can get a really nice groove texture out of it that you will use constantly. With a boatload of parameters. Yeah, that was a quick rundown of some of the custom nodes, and now we'll take a look at the full Rust texture itself. And it's not the most complicated graph in the world. If we get the 3D view, stretch out a bit. I'll try to do a quick rundown of the graph, but I will try to keep it brief. I really want to focus on the color slightly for a few of those tips. But we can see what I've done with the texture is I've created these are basically what we created in the Rust Flakes example, and I've done 2 of those, and I've layered them one over the other. So that's how we have. You can kind of make it out here. You can see we have 2 layers of that peeled effect of rust. It may not be the most accurate, but it looks kind of nice, and it creates a nice depth to the texture. So that's all I've done there. and all this here is just the base texture. So this base kind of like grungy texture that I've overlaid onto those peeled effects and that. Again, if you want, you can take a look in the files yourselves, but it would take quite a while if I were to do it now. So I'll just go straight into the color. Basically, with the color, I think what a lot of people do, and I think a lot of people have said in various tutorials, is that you can easily get away with doing a very quick color, like base color pass, and get away with it and just focus on like height information and roughness. But I think this is just straight up wrong, and I think people mislead other people a bit on it. You need to develop your base color for a believable material, and really go in depth with it. At least that's my opinion. So I start off with just a basic, just blending lots of different like gradients that I've grabbed from various areas of my map, areas of my graph, sorry. And I use overlay a lot in my blend nodes, and copy. They're basically overlay and copy are the ones I always use, and I generally just use just the opacity mask from these grayscale textures, and I just build up the color information very simply, very linearly. There's really nothing too complex going on, but it is just develop that base color, and it will pay off in the end. Because if you were to just plug this auto levels, this height information into just a gradient map, and then plug that into the base color, it just would not look good. It would look boring. And the main things that I do that are possibly interesting in the base color well, I would get the ambient occlusion information. I would invert that. I don't do this all the time, but I would invert that and blend that into the opacity of one of these. So I would get the ambient occlusion information and add color with that mask. So I'd get color into the cracks and kind of bring out those areas, those concave areas. But you can also do this with the curvature of your height map. So just we'd make a normal of the height map that we have, and from there we plug in a curvature smooth node, and we can select. We can use histogram select nodes to select if we want peaks, if we want flat areas, or if we want troughs or concave areas, and then we can use those as masks and build those into our texture information, our base color, as you can like highlight those peaks. I think it creates a really nice amount of depth. It doesn't always work. Again, just use your eye on these things. But it is a quick trick if you want some quick high frequency detail in there. And the other trick is using this light node. Again, this one works maybe 50-50. But if you fiddle around with the way the light hits the texture, you can how do you do it? Yeah, this does take a bit of getting used to. You can see how we can use that light mask that we get, and we plug that into the color as well, and again we can get a really nice depth of detail that may not be physically accurate, but personally, if it looks good, then you should just do it. Don't be afraid to do something that's not physically accurate if it looks good, unless of course you're required to do so. And then the rest is just, you know, basic hue, saturation, lightness. The rest you can look at for yourself, but that's about it for the procedurals aspects of the course or the tutorial. What we're going to do now is bring these procedural textures into Painter, and we're going to set up a basic height blend between two textures, and then we're going to go into that and see how we do that.